Hi, this is Bret Padres from Crypsis, and my one big thing for the 2020 Incident Response Forum is cybersecurity for a remote workforce. With the world coming to grips with a pandemic, many companies are shifting to a remote workforce. It's important to understand how this impacts your cybersecurity posture. For ransomware matters here at Crypsis in the past year, attacks to remote access technologies have outnumbered any other type of attack. Cybercriminals don't seem to be slowed down by this pandemic. Don't let remote work take precedence over cybersecurity. With a little forethought, you and your clients' data can be protected. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, and thanks, Tony, for another fantastic panel. This next panel is like no other we've ever had in two ways. First, we've never had a panel dedicated exclusively to the insider threat, which is, if you're going to look at any data breach, you want to look at it holistically, and you want to figure out who the perpetrator is. You might have to look, or you were likely going to look internally as well. So we decided to have a panel that covered that exactly. The other reason is because we actually have a case study that we're going to be giving about a particular incident, insider threat incident, and we're going to cover that sort of from the inside and mix those two topics together. Starting off, we have Yudhijit Bhattacharjee, and he's the author of the New York Times bestseller about famed U.S. trader Brian Regan, who was called The Spy Who Couldn't Spell. The book is called The Spy Who Couldn't Spell, A Dyslexic Trader, An Unbreakable Code, and the FBI's Hunt for Stolen Secrets. Regan was an Air Force Master Sergeant convicted of espionage and is currently serving a life sentence. Before Edward Snowden, Regan was probably the most famous government theft of secrets ever. And in researching his book, Yudhijit spent time interviewing two of the actual federal agents, Gary Walker and Bret Padres, who actually identified and tracked down Brian Regan. And both of them are on this panel. And by the way, at the end of the panel in the chat, I want to hear some suggestions for who should play each of them in the movie. Look forward to seeing those. So Yudhijit, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John, for inviting me. This is probably the most distinguished panel that I've been on without wearing any pants.
But excellent. A little too much information, Yudhijit, but we appreciate it. Right. Next panel
thank you.
Really the person on this panel who has the coolest job of anyone in of the entire 42 speakers. His name is Gary Walker. He is Senior Vice President and Chief Business Development Officer of OmniSystems, where he provides security solutions for government agencies. But that's not the job I'm talking about. I'm going to get to that in a second. Gary has perhaps one of the more broad and extraordinary biographies you'll see today. He was a flight sergeant in the Air Force, a division chief in the Department of Defense Counterintelligence, a senior special agent at Air Force Office of Special Investigations, a criminal investigator with the Department of Transportation, and deputy director at Department of Homeland Security. But what I really love about Gary's resume is he's also works for the NBA. And what does he do for the NBA? He helps coordinate security for the NBA at the Washington Wizards games, which is where I often see him walking around center court on patrol. How cool is that? Welcome, Gary. And I'm sorry the NBA is shut down for the time being, but for the Washington Wizards, maybe it's for the best. What do you think?
I wouldn't say that. I love my Wizards.
Wizards were having a very rough season. Next up is Bret Padres from the Crypsis group. He's another federal agent on the Reagan case, and he's now CEO of a data breach response firm, digital forensics firm, malware reverse engineering firm, whatever you want to call it, Crypsis. And he's got, like Gary Walker, just a tremendous resume, more than 25 years of experience in IR, including a special agent in the U.S. Air Force, OSI. Remember, Office of Special Investigations, like the Navy SEALs of the Air Force. And he was the lead agent there on numerous cyber attacks on U.S. companies. He was chief of research and development in the computer crimes unit for the Postal Service's IG office. He was director of IR at Mandiant and also digital forensics director at Strauss Friedberg right here in D.C., where I worked alongside of him for 5 years. What makes Bret so extraordinary is that he's really one of the few CEO technologists who's very comfortable running his firm or digging into a complex malware reverse engineering engagement. And as I said, I worked side by side with him for 5 years, and I really mean this. My take is that if you want to know what it was like to work with Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, then I suggest you spend some time working with Bret. Welcome, Bret. So great you could be here.
Thanks, John. It's always great to participate in this forum, and looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Well, and then to moderate this panel, we really had to find somebody who could match up with this experience. And Ashden Fein, though he didn't work on the Reagan case, he's a partner at Covington and Burling, and he fits in perfectly with this panel. He served as the lead trial attorney in the prosecution of Private Chelsea Manning for the leak to WikiLeaks. And his journey into IR started during his 13 years in the U.S. Army, first as a military intelligence officer and later as a lawyer in the JAG Corps, culminating as the chief of the criminal division for a command of 17,000 soldiers and as a legal advisor for an Army aviation organization deployed in Iraq. Given the legions of foreign soldiers that wake up every day with the sole goal of infiltrating U.S. systems, a national security expert like Ashden has become essential in so many IR matters. So it's great to have you moderating today, Ashden, and welcome to the IR Forum. And I'm going to turn it over to you while I go meet with the next panel and set it all up.
Thank you very much, John. Good morning, everyone. I'd also like to thank Bruce for putting on this event. Before we begin, of course, I'd like to highlight that the topics we intend to discuss today do not necessarily represent the views of our clients, firm, employers, or the U.S. government, for those of us who are going to discuss our past government experience. We're discussing a topic that's unfortunately quite relevant today in light of the pandemic, because as we all know, and I think you've heard already this morning, remote access has expanded the threat surface or the edge of security for most organizations. Additionally, with individuals working remotely or the number of individuals working on site being significantly less, employees and users are now operating in much more isolated environments without direct oversight or supervision. And this type of environment is exactly the foundation for past notorious insider threats who pulled off some of the largest heists, those that we're going to talk about today. In my own experience, for instance, 10 years ago, this month, Private Chelsea Manning worked on a night shift in a secure facility of very little direct supervision. She bragged online that her military organization spent 95% of its efforts on physical security and managing operational security while not focusing on information security. As we all know, she exploited these weaknesses to steal over 750,000 records and documents, most of which were classified. As we'll hear in a moment from Yudhijit, 19 years ago, Brian Regan spent hours surfing classified networks and went unnoticed by security officials at his agency. He created an extensive electronic record that nobody bothered to look at until Gary Walker and Bret, Padres, our fellow panelists, were on the case. And by that time, he had smuggled thousands of pages of classified information out of his agency's building. So before we continue, I would like to at least address a fundamental question that I frequently get in private practice, which is, who are insiders? What are insiders? Very quickly, according to Verizon, there are 5 types of insiders. The careless worker, employees or partners who misappropriate resources, break policies, mishandle data, install unauthorized applications, use unapproved workarounds, or also sort of known as probably about 90% of the workforce right now worldwide. There's the inside agent, someone who's stealing information on behalf of someone else, the disgruntled employee, someone who's determined to do harm against their organization, the malicious insider, someone who's stealing information or exceeding their access for personal gain, and then finally, as Verizon describes it, the feckless third party, a business partner who compromises security through negligence, misuse, or malicious access. So why does this matter for organizations? Well, according to the same report by Verizon, 57% of database breaches involve insider threats within an organization. These are 2019 statistics. 20% of cybersecurity incidents and 15% of data breaches are due to misuse of privileges. And 61, this is the statistic that I found most shocking, 61% of internal actors are not in positions with a high level of access or stature, which is directly relevant to today's how today's organizations are operating, because of course we have many more employees and users that are not typically using remote access that we now find are. So with that, I'd like to start with our panelists. First, Yudhijit. Yeah, as a former military intelligence officer and prosecutor of Chelsea, I was quite familiar with Brian Regan. But your book explored many fascinating and new aspects of the story for me. I know you probably won't hold it up for the audience, but I will. So for those of us that may not be familiar with Brian Regan, can you provide a brief summary of how and why the military intelligence professional stole classified information, which he ultimately offered to sell to foreign intelligence services? And then also, can you just provide us some examples of how he was able to pull off this heist for so long without being detected?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Ashden. So Brian Regan was a master sergeant in the Air Force, and he had been assigned to the NRO in 1995. He'd actually served admirably before that time, and at the NRO, his career wasn't really going anywhere, but he was concerned because he was coming up for mandatory retirement in the year 2000, because he wasn't going to get promoted beyond the rank of master sergeant. He had 4 kids by 1998 or 99. He had 4 children. His wife was a stay-at-home mom, and he was finding it difficult to sort of pay for everything that he needed on his salary. But more important than that was his anxiety over what was to come once he retired. At the same time, there was, a psychological sort of aspect to Brian's crime. He was severely dyslexic, and a lot of people that he had interacted with throughout his career had sort of a dim view of him. They thought that he was not very bright. And so Brian kind of suffered, all his life from being underestimated and being sort of dismissed as somebody, not worthy of much respect. And so Brian sort of had 2 reasons for wanting to profit from his position of access. The first being that he was very worried about what would happen once he retired. Since he was kind of socially isolated, he hadn't reached out to people to see what kinds of job opportunities there would be once he retired. And, there were plenty. So it wasn't a legitimate worry in that sense. And the second was that he felt that he'd been disregarded and insulted and dismissed all his life. And so he had this kind of anger inside of him. He wanted to get back at society. And that's how he decided that he was going to steal classified secrets and try to sell them to a hostile country. What Brian Regan did have at the time was access to Intel-Link, which, as many of our audience members probably know, was the classified internet for various intelligence agencies. And at the time, in order to promote data sharing between intelligence agencies, employees, every employee like Brian Regan had access to sort of the full Monty. Through Intel-Link, they could access material that had been uploaded by the CIA, by the DIA, and so on. And so Brian Regan started to poke around on Intel-Link to see what he could collect, specifically to sell to the governments of Libya, Iraq, Iran, and a few other countries. And he started to kind of download and print out tons of information, satellite imagery, CIA reports, various types of documents and images that he was able to access. And the funny thing is that most of these searches that he was doing on IntelliLink had nothing whatsoever to do with his job responsibilities. Of course, this we all know in hindsight, but since we're discussing, everything from an insider threat perspective, I guess, and I'm sure that Bret and Gary will talk about this, the fact that his searches went completely unnoticed for so long, was one of the ways in which he was able to remain undetected. His plot was able to remain hidden. This is, I'm trying to address the question you asked right at the end of your question about how he was able to get away with this for so long. So there was almost no monitoring whatsoever of his activities on IntelliLink. There was almost no monitoring whatsoever of his activities of printing out material that he was downloading from IntelliLink, because even that, had it been monitored, would have been a clue that he was trying to collect information, since there was no other way to take that information physically away from the NRO without actually printing out those documents. And so what Brian Regan did was he printed these materials out. He hid them underneath his gym bag, underneath his gym clothes. There was a little gym attached to the NRO where he used to go to work out. He was severely overweight. He wanted to lose weight. And he would just walk out of the building day after day with his gym bag with all of these documents sort of stored underneath his dirty clothes, because he knew that, none of the guards at the NRO was really going to ask to check his bag. So it was, of course, a total lapse of virtual security, cybersecurity internally, but there were also lapses in physical security, because he could have been discovered, at some point when he was taking all of this material out of the building. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Yudhijit. Gary, can you explain to the audience when you first became involved in the search for an insider threat at NRO, which ultimately led to Brian Regan?
Sure. I actually started working at the National Reconnaissance Office. I was previously I had been working at the Air Force Office of Special Investigations as a counterintelligence investigator and as a counterespionage operator working at their headquarters. So coming into the NRO, I was fresh out of the counterintelligence arena within the Air Force, the strategic counterintelligence arena. So I left the Air Force in October of 2000. In December of 2000, I was actually assigned and working at the National Reconnaissance Office when I was asked to come and attend a meeting with my supervisor and a couple of other analysts. We also had the FBI in attendance, and essentially what they were there for was to brief us on an investigation that they were working on. It was an unknown subject investigation. Essentially, they knew that there was a mole. However, they had no idea who that mole was. So they wanted an investigator to come in and listen to the information to see if there was something that we could do at the National Reconnaissance Office.
Yeah, they didn't even know what agency that mole might be in. Isn't that right?
Yes, they didn't know which agency it was in. They actually came to National Reconnaissance Office last. We were the last big intelligence agency that they actually briefed this case to, because NRO was relatively new as it related to being a known intelligence agency, because prior to that, they had done a lot of their work really discreetly without a lot of exposure, a lot of attention. So coming to NRO was really the last stop for the FBI, because they had very little luck at really identifying a viable subject at that point. So we listened to what they had to say, and as I listened to the information that was being told to us at the time, I because I had just left the Air Force OSI, I just immediately started thinking about the things that I was exposed to at Air Force OSI. And because I was a desk officer at the Air Force, really looking at opportunities and what we would call strategic opportunities coming across my desk on a daily basis, I immediately thought that maybe this wasn't what they thought it was. Maybe it was just really a strategic act that's being conducted on part of one of the counterintelligence agencies for the U.S. government. So I just asked if I could just coordinate it and see if there was if that activity had been coordinated with any of these agencies that participated in these operations. I did an initial coordination with my former agency at the time, Air Force OSI, and once I got the results back, I realized that I think we have a problem. So initially, I just kind of thought it was probably not that big of a deal, something we didn't need to worry about. It was just a lack of coordination. But once we received the response, I realized that this was potentially a problem. So that led to the National Reconnaissance Office at that point opening up its own investigation and beginning a search for a mole within our organization.
Thanks, Gary. And Bret, now could you just provide us a background on how you then became involved in your role in the investigation?
Yeah, so it's probably pretty short. But first off, I'd like to say, and I think Gary would agree with me, that a lot of the credit for this case goes to Steve Carr, an FBI agent, and that's documented in and Yudhijit spent a lot of time talking to Stephen, who is no longer with us, but he was just an incredible agent and did a ton of work on this case, and it wouldn't have been successful without him. I personally was an agent, computer crime investigator at the Washington field office, and I think I might have got assigned to this case by accident because some other agent was supposed to get it, who they couldn't find, and so they came and got me and said I need to go over to the NRO right away, and didn't tell me what it was about. I suspect the other agent thought this was sort of an assignment that was a detail that was kind of an annoyance, and so got out of it. So I went over there. An interesting point that I don't think anybody's touched on yet, right, is the name of the book. Yudhijit mentions that Brian was searching Intel Link and had also, sort of prepared to pass documents to foreign entities, and it was through those communications that he, with the foreign embassies and through his searching, that there was actually at this point in the investigation, we didn't have the searching, we just had the documents. So you could see the misspellings in those documents, and that was a really big clue for Gary and his work, which ultimately led into bringing in myself. So once Gary was successul, and I'd like Gary to tell that story a little bit about how he took sort of these misspellings and for an unsub and sort of turned that into a very different investigation that then led to the work that I did on the computer side.
Yeah, I mean, once we made a decision that we were going to open up our own investigation at the National Reconnaissance Office, the question was, what are you going to do and how are you going to do it? And because I had a background not only in investigations, but also in intelligence analysis, I was familiar with really just the approach for looking at indicators of espionage. So what I was advised to do, and what I decided to do, was really to basically commandeer a small office in the building and to begin looking through the records of potential NRO employees who may be involved in this espionage activities. At the time, I was told there was about 50,000 people that that would be part of this population that I would have to consider. And the question that I had at the time was there was really no automated way to look at records. Everything was physical or on a microfiche. So essentially what I had to do was really just find a room, get myself a table on a desk, and just have records carted to me. And what I would do was take a look at what I had was an initial list of indicators and go through these records and see if I could find indicators within these personal personnel security files. It became pretty taxing and it was pretty boring initially. And I got a visit from one of our psychologists that was assigned to the National Reconnaissance Office on detail. And he had worked some spy cases and he wanted to discuss what I was doing and to take a look at how far I had progressed. And he took a look at really what I considered my list of indicators, and he added some things. And then I proceeded to conduct more detailed reviews of the files, and really just looking for things that I felt as an investigator, as a former Air Force enlisted guy, as really a counter-espionage guy, as a counter-espionage investigator, and as an analyst. I had to take a look at it from many different angles to try to assess each one of these files to see if any file meant anything to me. And what I was able to do early on and after speaking with Dr. Kropchak was really to come up with just the things that would trigger me, would trigger an additional look, like if they had training in cryptology, if the individual was enlisted over the grade of E7. I was particularly looking for an E7 or above because in the letter, the individual stated that he was unhappy and he was retiring after 20 years. And in my mind, I just didn't feel that an Air Force officer would be unhappy after 20 years and return without retiring and wanting and really looking for some satisfaction in his career. I also thought that a civilian who would be assigned in the intelligence community would not be looking to retire at 20 years. Many Air Force officers don't retire at 20 years. So in my mind, I felt that this was an enlisted person, probably at the grade of technical sergeant or master sergeant or higher. And he may have been disappointed or may have been slighted for some reason. So I did take that into account when I was looking at many of the files. And that was a pretty good hunch. And I think a lot of what I incorporated into my analysis, there were 3 or 4 different hunches that I relied on to sort of make it a lot easier for me because I didn't have the benefit of analysis or analytics or data systems. So that eventually led to me identifying Brian's record, and his record met many of the criteria that I identified. You know, he was an Air Force Master Sergeant, E7. He was retiring. He had been slighted at one point in his career. He actually left a letter, there was a letter in his security file that really, really made me feel that he was the guy. And it was a rebuttal letter to a performance evaluation that he had received. And in that rebuttal letter were really some of the dyslexic terms that were exhibited in the letter that we had received from the FBI. So I had to continue to look through another 20,000 records, but I knew probably within about a month and a half that I had my guy, but I still had to continue to see if there was anyone else involved.
So Gary, that's super helpful. I'm afraid you might have lost most of the audience when you mentioned paper files and microfiche. No one might know what those are. I should have stopped you then. But that's an amazing feat, hearing how you had to do that. And that's a good transition because you're talking about the different breadcrumbs you as an investigator were piecing together to try to find the ultimate culprit, which you did. Yudhijit, throughout your book, you also described the breadcrumbs that eventually led to Brian, sort of even a broader view. There are personal factors such as the financial problems and infidelity. You mentioned one earlier, psychological problems that you mentioned earlier. And then, of course, forensic leads, which we'll talk about a little bit more detail in a moment, like the web browsing, printing logs, the fact that he's dyslexic and the frequent misspelling of words. Given all that, how do you think organizations, which likely are dealing with exponentially more data and the complicating data protection regimes that now exist worldwide, given all that, how organizations could better identify potentially problematic insiders? And then the second part is, does your view change at all at the current time during this pandemic response?
Well, that's a great question, Ashden. Obviously, in the current environment, we're probably, once this thing ends, and I hope it ends soon, once this thing ends, we're probably going to go into a regime where there's going to be a lot more teleworking. There's going to be a lot more data access, web tools, so that people can share information in real time across various platforms. And of course, all of that makes systems all the more vulnerable to being exploited for espionage or other kinds of intellectual property theft. I think that Brian Regan's case is instructive in many ways. Clearly the monitoring, which I've mentioned earlier, there was hardly any monitoring of his activities online, and I don't think that. Of course, now we've got a much more sophisticated, a vaster sort of network of computers in any large organization. We've got databases, things like that. So probably the ways in which that Brian Regan could have been monitored years ago would no longer apply, but there'd be sort of, new ways to monitor people's employees' sort of access to various things. I think in addition to simply monitoring, for example, I know that one of the things Brian Regan did occasionally was he tried to do some of his IntelliLink searching from another person's computer within his pod of computers. And I think that was noticed at the time, but nobody made much of it. They just ignored it. I think any behavior of that kind, where an employee is somehow trying to evade self-identification while accessing data, I think that should be counted as a red flag, because you'll always have an alibi. If an employee, if a bad apple is trying to do something like that, they'll always have a story ready. They'll say, I simply had to check, my computer isn't working, or I wasn't able to log in on my machine today. There's something wrong with it, so I logged in using your computer was already on, so I've logged in. I think that kind of behavior might be it might be a red flag. I'm sure there's many red flags. I'm just mentioning one that can be directly kind of taken from the Brian Regan episode. I think that when employees write emails, I'm now segueing from what Gary said about. I mean, Gary just, if you read the book, you'll understand just how amazing Gary's work was in identifying Brian as a potential suspect. I mean, now we know that he was the spy, but picking somebody like that out of tens of thousands of employees is remarkable. And Gary, wasn't able to search through files, through digital files. He was searching physically through paper records. But what I mean to say is that I think there should be ways of monitoring or searching email communications that employees are sending to each other and their supervisors, because I know there are privacy concerns here, but this is a workplace where expectations of privacy are much more limited than as a private citizen. And I think that if somebody, I can imagine if Brian Regan's files had been digitized at the time, and if Gary had some way of searching for certain expressions or phrases within emails that he was sending to people, where, some echoes of disgruntlement or dissatisfaction might have been picked up, that might be another red flag. I mean, employees are disgruntled for various legitimate reasons. So disgruntlement by itself does not necessarily mean that somebody is about to embark on theft of trade secrets. But I do think that using tools of, doing better searches or doing some kind of searching of the things that employees are writing to each other in the process, even on Snapchat or Slack, if there were some tools, software tools to search through that information, it might be possible to identify people who could potentially be insider threats. I don't want to take up more time. I'll let you move on.
Thanks, Yudhijit. But Bret, maybe following up on that description, I find myself frequently advising clients responding to a data breach or cybersecurity incident, who are faced with having to go through vast amounts of logs and may have very little to no clue other than something happened. So given your experiences, 19 years ago with Regan all the way through and including today, what are some of the technologies that can be leveraged to help in this process? And what can organizations do to better prepare themselves for these types of future events with insiders?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's no perfect answers. And it's sort of the gumshoe work that was done with Brian Regan that you still have to kind of rely on somewhat. There are better tools to give you better visibility. It's easy to look at Brian Regan and say sort of, after the fact that this, could have had red flags, but it's hard, right? So one of the things I did in this case, Yudhijit's right. Nobody was looking at his searches on IntelLink for the purposes of catching him with espionage, but they were capturing that activity from a security perspective. So it was the IT folks who were looking into security systems from an attack perspective. And so they had those records, and those are ultimately the records I used to sort of map out everything that Regan did. And I brought into that analysis, when he rented a car, when he went on leave, when he checked out a GPS system, when he printed things. And from that, literally created a graphic sort of model of that and blew it up and put it on the wall of the skiff I was working in, because it really gave a picture of what espionage looked like when you can correlate all these things together. And I think there are lessons that can be learned about that in, catching future insider threat cases when you correlate these things. But it really is about getting the data and then looking at it from that perspective. So DLP, data loss prevention tools, are very helpful in determining, whether or not sensitive data is moving across your network. And then, it's up to then the analyst to make the decision if that's proper. A lot of those tools can send up a lot of false positives and cause people to run down a lot of things. And I think that's many times the reason why that even though the technology is there, you can look for patterns of when people log in. You can look for whether or not their searches are consistent with the type of searches they should do for their job. In other words, are they looking at documents they would typically need for their job? Are the documents they're looking at deviating from the things they looked at last year or last week or last month? Those types of things. I would say, though, that in so much as people talk about the insider threat problem, it's sort of like the advanced persistence threat or the nation state attack problem, where some people have said that it's not if, it's when. And I think some people kind of a lot of people agree with that, but they're not about themselves. They think, we'll never get hacked, or, when I get involved in a data breach, many times the things that I'm told can't happen are the things that actually did happen, right? So I've worked many insider threat cases where they knew something happened because their data was where it wasn't supposed to be, but they hadn't yet really looked inside. And there have been a few large cases in which once we convinced the client they really need to look inside, that's when they sort of, the case sort of broke open. So, yeah, I think more and more technology can help, but it is a mindset change, resources that may not get any real return, right? Because you're not, you hope you're not finding anything. But to have somebody who's consistently looking at these technology and logs and coming up empty, it's hard to get the resources to keep that going.
And thanks, Bret. Is that is that a capability that private organizations outside of the government domain can actually implement, and processes that they could follow in order to mitigate this risk?
Absolutely. And it's the wide spectrum of just, even if you just use firewall logs, there's some analysis can be done. There are authentication logs. You can look at when people are logging in. And on the other end of the spectrum is some of the stuff that Yudhijit was touching on, where there are technologies where you can sort of automated look for sentiment through communications. A company I used to work for developed some very interesting technology that was sort of modeled after some work that some behavior psychologists doing like psycholinguistics and come up with these very sophisticated algorithms. And it was great. Everybody loved it. If we went to a customer and talked to them about the use of this technology, they raved about it. But not nobody, a lot of people just couldn't get past the privacy concerns. And it kind of freaks people out to even know that there's some algorithm reading their email. So I think that privacy is definitely pushing in a different direction on some of those more invasive techniques.
Thanks, Bret. Gary, sort of building on that, but maybe not necessarily focused on the technology side. 19 years have passed since you were locked in sounds like a dungeon, going through thousands of records. I guess, what is your advice for the audience in regards to how best to approach an insider threat problem, and how to sort of organize yourself in order to both investigate, and then ideally, before you have to investigate, to prevent an insider threat? Hey, Gary, you might be on mute.
Yes, I am. Yes, with 19 years of learning since the Regan case, the first thing is never discount the insider as being a suspect of what has happened. In many cases, that's probably the first place to start. Rule out the internal threat, so then you could really stop the bleeding if there is some bleeding inside. And then aside from that, I think the best approach for dealing with an insider with today's technologies and today's approaches to taking large amounts of data and looking at people quickly is to ensure that you have a capability to do that. And if you don't, that you have the ability to reach out to those that do have that capability. There are a lot of agencies that don't ever consider the insider as being the biggest threat to their way of doing business. But when it does happen, they don't have any organic capability to respond or to react. And so they sort of stand still, or they really don't do anything for a minute. But there are lots of organizations out there that actually have the capability to support that response, or to help you sort of organize and orchestrate and look at really where the problem is coming from. Bret talked about technology as being really a game changer today. Didn't have that 20 years ago, but I think that if you don't use it, it's just like not having it. So you just have to be willing to use it, and be willing to deal with the data, what you learn, because there were some things that we learned during the Regan investigation after all that manual work that it was hard for some people to really grasp. It was almost unimaginable, unacceptable, and didn't want to be accepted. But I think what we have to be willing to do is just to deal with what the data actually tells us, and if it points a certain direction, you just got to follow it until you determine that is really not the suspect or that's not the problem. So I think the big thing is really just accepting the threat and dealing with the internal threat initially, just making sure that there's nothing internal that's going on and going from.
And just having that mindset too, right, where you have to be willing. There's no technology that's going to tell you, what's going on. They'll inform you and give you some clues, but you need to have an approach with investigative tech mindset.
Absolutely.
Ashden. All right, Ashden, thank you so much. Terrific job, and what a great story and a great panel.